Right, okay. So can people hear me? Excellent. Right. So I'm going to try and do some technical wizardry, or what to me is technical wizardry, of screen sharing a PowerPoint presentation. Is that working? Okay, excellent. And can people see? People can see my face in some little box. Cool. Okay, excellent. All right. Well, I will start the slideshow then. Okay. So as Adam said, I'm James. I'm just gonna I'll just start. I won't do any sort of preamble. So I'll start by saying something that people who haven't come across these kind of ideas before might find a bit surprising. And that is to say that before roughly the 17th century, so the 1600s, white people did not exist. There is no evidence in the historical record of something called a white person before roughly the 17th century. Now, what do I mean by that? Do I mean that people who look like me didn't exist? No, I don't mean that clearly. But what I mean is that before a certain point in history, nobody would have thought to look at somebody from Finland, somebody from Poland, somebody from England, somebody from France, and say that all of these people are part of the same racial group, and nobody did that. And so, to quote the author of this book, The Invention of the White Race by Theodore Allen, when the first sorry, hang on. Sorry. So there's a quote there from Theodore Allen, which I think makes a similar point to the one I just made. But there's another quote in his book. He says, the novelty of this form of social identity, i.e. whiteness, is to be noted in the comments of the writer Morgan Godwin, who in 1680 found it necessary to explain to his English readers that in Barbados, the word white was the general name for Europeans. This was a novel idea for English readers in the 1680s. And so what I'm going to talk about today is that the question of the origin of white supremacy is also the question of the invention of something called the white race in the first place. And I will address these historical origins, and then Adam's going to talk about sort of subsequent developments. So this history is all wrapped up in two related historical phenomena, and those are the development of capitalism and the development of early colonialism. This is in the English context. So there's a lot of material written about this, and I'm really kind of stripping it down and in some ways simplifying things. But during the 16th century, so the 1500s, as England began to export more and more wool to Europe, the landowning feudal lords came to realize that they would actually be much better served by raising sheep in order to produce wool that they could sell for a better profit than they would be by continuing to grow food. And thus began a process known to history as the enclosures. This is a very long process that went on over a whole, about 4 centuries. But essentially, this process was the peasants, as they then were, in the English word for them was villeins. They were kicked off the land, and farmland that had been kind of feudal farmland, and a lot of the common land that people anybody could use, were transformed into pasture land to raise sheep. And because sheep farming is less labour intensive than food production, only a tiny proportion of the people that were kicked off the land were re-employed on a kind of new basis as shepherds. And so masses of people were made homeless and landless and took to wandering the country, vainly looking for work in a society that didn't have factories yet. It didn't have the kind of, didn't have the capacity really to absorb all of these workers, which a Marxist would say this is the creation of the proletariat. It's the creation of a mass of people who have nothing to kind of, they don't own anything except their ability to work for somebody else for a wage. And so this is all part of the context where a number of commentators around the turn of the 17th century, so late 1500s, early 1600s, saw a lot of promise in following the Spanish example that had already happened with Columbus and all that, of exploration and colonization of other parts of the world. So, for example, Richard Hakluyt, very interesting kind of example. He was an English writer who was really obsessed with this idea, and much of his life's work was sort of bringing together various accounts of the efforts of the colonization by other powers. And he lived in Paris for a while, and he translated accounts of the Spanish colonization of the Americas into English. And he was, in order to make the case to people, to the crown, basically, that this was the path that the English ruling class, the English crown, whatever, should follow. And he argued essentially along two lines for why this should be done. First, that colonization would be a source of great wealth for the crown and for the country. And he used the example of the massive amounts of gold that had flowed into Europe as a result of the Spanish colonization and their, brutal exploitation of the indigenous people of the Americas. And he also said that colonization would provide a solution to this issue of all of these masses of people who were unemployed, which writers like Richard Hakluyt and the kind of ruling class that he served were really quite concerned about, because if you have all these people who are very unhappy about their rapidly deteriorating conditions of life, that's a recipe for rebellion and people fighting back for their rights. And so Hakluyt proposed, and this is a quote, about what could be achieved by colonizing Virginia, which is currently a state of the US, but it's sort of a part on the eastern coast of North America. And he said, this enterprise will be for the manifold employment of numbers of idle men, and for breeding of many sufficient, I can't read it because my own face is in the way, sufficient and the utterance of the great quantity of the commodities of our realm. So we can get rid of all these poor people that are causing us a problem, and the excess people, and we can, get rich off of it, is the sort of modern translation of that. And there's another example there, which I won't read out, but it makes the same points, quite explicitly about we've got all these idle people, having no means of labour to relieve their misery, can't find work, do likewise swarm in lewd and naughty practices, i.e. they're rebelling, so that if we seek not some ways for their foreign employment, we must provide shortly more prisons and corrections for their bad conditions. So this was oh my God, what's going on there? This was a big part of the context for these early colonizing efforts, which I'll come on to explain why they were so important. So lacking the finances to fund the colonization schemes, because due to a number of wars and other things, the crown was bankrupt, unlike the Spanish crown, which financed its own colonizing efforts by and large. The English crown didn't finance the colonizing efforts. They instead turned to groups of merchants, and these groups of merchants were called companies of merchants, which in those days, company meant, in good company, a group of people. And this is, interestingly, where the word comes from for the modern company, a corporation company. And so they turned to these groups of merchants to finance the colonizing efforts. And in return for financing the venture, these merchants would receive something in return. And what they would receive was a monopoly of trade. So only they would have the right to export products from the colonies to Britain. And for them, they thought that for this to be a profitable exercise, what they would do is they would establish intensive cultivation of what we now call cash crops. So crops that you intensively cultivate and then you can sell for a decent profit. So this is plantation agriculture. this is the beginning of the plantation agriculture of tobacco, indigo, and then what's particularly famous that I'm sure we've all heard about, the cotton and sugar plantations that would later characterize African slavery in the Americas. So actually the first plantations to be established were not in the Americas by England, were not in the Americas, they were in Ireland. But those are kind of secondary to what the main topic of discussion now. So we can come back to that in the discussion, but I'm going to keep talking about the North American context. So in North America, where the system of white supremacy was born, the colony, first successful English colony at Jamestown, Virginia, was established in 1607. Almost immediately, so within 3 years, by 1610, attention began to turn to tobacco production. So these merchants who had put money forward for these colonizing efforts, when they got to North America, they discovered what the cash crop that they were going to produce for export to England and elsewhere for a profit was going to be, and it was going to be tobacco. Now, many of the Caribbean colonies, such as Barbados, which was settled by the English from 1625, began likewise with tobacco, but for a number of reasons, they soon turned to sugar instead. So there were different crops involved. There was cotton as well and indigo. But the important point is that successful plantation production, so this large-scale production of cash crops, as kind of any production really, would require two things. Firstly, a labour force to do the work, and secondly, some means of actually compelling that labour force to do the work. So, if you can bring a load of workers over, but how do you stop them if they don't like the conditions, running away and joining the Native Americans, as actually quite a lot of people did, or from setting themselves up on their own farms, on their own bit of land, if they can get it somehow, as many tried, or indeed for coming together and fighting to improve conditions. So they needed these two kind of conditions in order to be able to successfully produce these profitable crops. And at first, the English colonists tried to enslave Native Americans. This wasn't very successful, however. The natives lived on a vast continent, and the English were quite, vulnerable with their sort of one little enclave in Virginia. They were totally reliant on imports of food and other things, and clothes and so on from England. The Native Americans could run away if captured into the continent that they knew and that where their sort of people lived, and their people could fight and negotiate with the English to secure the release of captured Native American people from the different nations. And in order to try to make this system work, the English tried to establish a system of alliances with different warring tribes and so on to create a supply of Indian slave labour, but this failed ultimately. And so they turned to that ready source of labour that I've already discussed, the unemployed English workers who'd been kicked off the land. And so in order to do this, like I've said, it's one thing to bring the workers over. It's another thing to actually get them to work. And because, why would they necessarily want to? And so what they invented, the English colonists, they invented a system which is called indentured servitude. And this is really important in understanding the origins of white supremacy. So the way this worked basically was that in return for the cost of the voyage across from Europe to America, which the employer would pay, a worker would agree to work for that employer for a number of years. So usually 7. it ended up working out usually at about 7 during much of the 17th century. The worker would not have the right to end the contract early, and nor would they have the right to move to a different employer. But at first, they would be entitled to once the, part of the contract would be that once you'd finished your 7 years, you would be given a gift of, it was called corn and clothes. And it had different things in the contract. Sometimes it was a plot of land. Often it was just a decent set of clothes and a supply of food. But the hope and the sort of pull of this for English workers, who were lied to about what they were letting themselves in for quite often, and some of them were kidnapped. But those who willingly went for this, the reason that they did it, what they hoped for, was that after their period of 7 years or whatever it was of servitude, they could then set up as independent tobacco farmers on their own account. So I'll have to go and do horrible toil as a servant, where I don't have any rights, basically, for 7 years. But then I will be able to become one of the big tobacco planters afterwards, and I'll get rich. That was the kind of, or at least I'll have a sort of modest, independent existence. And that was their hope. But this hope was frustrated because within 10 years of tobacco cultivation, the price of the crop began to plummet for a number of reasons that are not relevant to this discussion. Importantly, this had two effects. Well, it had many effects, but the two that are important for us are that firstly, it made small-scale farming, what the indentured servants were hoping to do after the end of their indentures. It made small-scale farming completely unprofitable and untenable. Independent farmers, such as those who just finished their indentures, they would not be able to produce the kind of scale that would allow them to keep afloat. And so they basically couldn't survive other than by selling their land to the big landowners and working for the big landowners for a wage. So what this resulted in was an incredibly unequal society. At the top was the tiny, tiny rich elite of these capitalist plantation farmers who owned lots of these indentured servants and who controlled the trade with England that everybody was reliant on for basic supplies, and so could screw people out of things, out of their rights and out of what they needed, and exploit people at every turn. There was a tiny minority of them at the top, and then a mass of incredibly poor people, working in absolutely dire conditions at the bottom. And there were few, if any, prospects of social mobility. So if you were in that mass of poor people, whether you're indentured or whether you're not indentured and you're technically free, you had almost no prospect of moving out of that situation. That's where you were stuck. And so therefore, there was no sort of stable middle-class element who could play a mediating role in between the interests of the rich and of the poor. There was no middle class that could say to the people at the bottom, work hard and you can become like us, or that could exercise their kind of influence over the poor workers to get them to sort of, just put up with their situation. And that's very important, and we're going to come back to that. But the second important thing about this situation of the collapse in tobacco prices was that it meant that for the plantation system to remain profitable, the employers felt that they had to intensify the exploitation of the workers. So if I'm getting half the price or even less than that for each pound of tobacco, I'm going to get double as much tobacco out of each worker in order to stay afloat. And that's going to mean basically inflicting even worse conditions of life and of work onto those poor workers that we were talking about. And so this was done with some really quite extreme violence, actually. and it was done by taking away rights that even before this, hundreds of years ago, the free men, the ones who weren't tied to the land or anything, the free workers would have had way more rights that were then taken away from them in Virginia because of the situation, because of the actions of this ruling elite. So the kind of violence and problems that I'm talking about for these people. So one example, in 1612, the governor of Virginia disciplined some labourers who had run away because they didn't want to put up with their situation anymore and had been caught and brought back. And he didn't just give them a sort of a slap on the wrist. This is a quote from a document at the time. Some he appointed to be hanged, some burned, i.e. at the stake, some to be broken upon wheels, which means that you were tied to the wheel of a wagon and then the wheel basically pulled round so that all your bones were broken and then you were left to die, and some to be shot. All because these people had decided that they didn't want to continue under the terms of the labour that they had, willingly signed the contract for. Corporal and even capital punishment was common enough, but the preferred tactic, if you think about what it is that the interest of the boss, the capitalists was, which was to get people to produce things for profit, the preferred tactic of punishing the workers was to extend the period of indenture. So if it was quite common, if you ran away for a month, then a multiple of 1 month would be added to the amount of time that you have to serve, often about 10 times. So you run away for a month, we're going to add 10 months to the time at the end that you have to continue in this situation that you're in. So servants weren't allowed to marry, and since, due to the kind of English legal precedent, the cost of raising illegitimate children, which all children of servants were illegitimate because servants weren't allowed to marry according to the law in Virginia, the cost of that would have to be taken on by the county authority, which in this case was the Virginia authority. Normally that would mean that the father of the child would have to reimburse the county for the expense of raising the child until it could be bound to work. But since the servants normally couldn't afford this, what happened was either their master would pay the county, and then the master would say, and you're going to reimburse me by serving another 5 years, or the county would say, you're going to finish your indenture to your master, and then you're going to serve us for 5 years. And bear in mind that the county was the planter elite, the people who owned all of these servants in the first place. So the mother's term in that instance was also extended to reimburse the master for lost working time. And, as you can imagine in this situation, abuse of all kinds was absolutely rampant by the masters. The other really important element of indentured servitude was that by a certain point, quite early on, a new practice came in, which was called assigning labourers. So originally, you would go and you would know, you would sign a contract that said, I'm going to go and work for Mr. Smith. And for about the first 10 years, you would go and work for Mr. Smith, and there was no question about that. But after quite a short time, this was basically changed and this new system of assigning was brought in. So you might sign a contract in England to say, okay, Mr. Smith, you pay for my passage to go to Virginia and I will work for you for 7 years. But you get there and you find that Mr. Smith has sold the contract that he signed with you to Mr. Jones. You now have to work for Mr. Jones and you have no choice in the matter. And if you object and refuse to work, you could be subject to the kinds of punishments that I was talking about before. So, this is trading people about, for limited terms of servitude, actually moving around these contracts where people have no say over where they're allowed to go. And so, understandably, this has led historians to draw comparisons between this system of indentured servitude and the chattel slavery of Africans that would develop from not long afterwards. Edmund Morgan, for example, who's a kind of a preeminent historian who wrote a book called American Freedom, American Slavery, he argued that, this is the quote, "Servitude in Virginia's tobacco fields approached closer to slavery than anything known at the time in England. Men served longer, were subjected to more rigorous punishments, were traded about as commodities already in the 1620s. Importantly, this is not Morgan, this is me, the labourers themselves used the word slavery to describe their condition quite commonly. There's a very famous account by a guy called Charles Bailey, which I think is from the 1640s. I can't see the footnotes on my thing here. And he wrote an account about how he was spirited away, i.e. either kidnapped or tricked into going from Gravesend. And he said that I was sold as a bond slave for 7 years. So this is how people themselves saw the situation. And in the words of African-American historian Lerone Bennett Jr., white servitude, we shouldn't say white servitude. In this early period, as I've said, white people didn't exist. So European servitude, you might say, for the earlier period, was the proving ground. The plantation system, the slave trade, the sexual exploitation of servant women, the whipping post and slave chain and branding iron, the overseer, the house servant, the Uncle Tom, all these mechanisms were tried and perfected on white European men and women. It is plain that nothing substantial can be said about the mechanisms of black bondage in America except against the background and within the perspective of white bondage. And that isn't an unusual view for historians of this period. And I think it's quite accurate. Like he says, all of these methods were tried out first on the first, bound labour, indentured labour that they had. So it's important here, I think, before we move on, to just sort of clarify what I am and what I am not saying. Clearly there was a difference between indenture and slavery. One was temporary and one was not. One was hereditary and one was not. And that is an enormous difference that shouldn't be downplayed. But I think this is an important point because we often look at this period of history and the early development of the transatlantic slave trade through the lens of a later period. So because the 18th century was so defined by, and the 19th century was so defined by a racialized slavery that took a particular form, then we often assume that that's how it started, but that isn't necessarily the case. And so it's important to note here that there is actually not that much evidence that the early participation in the African slave trade by Europeans was motivated by a kind of a prejudice towards Africans. When Portuguese and then later Spanish, English and other traders arrived on the west coast of Africa, they did find an existing slave trade, which they opportunistically engaged in, justifying it on the spurious grounds that Christianity allowed for the owning of non-Christian slaves. Now, what were they interested in? They wanted workers to be put to work making a profit. That was their motivation. Because it's important to remember, that slavery has existed for a lot of human history and exists now, and it is first and foremost an economic institution. The desire for slaves in this period was not something due to some irrational hatred of Africans, of people with a different skin colour, for which there is little evidence in the historical record, but it was motivated by the desire to secure a supply of labour to be put to work producing profitable commodities. And I think there's I think this is summed up very well by the historian and former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, Eric Williams, who wrote a book called Capitalism and Slavery. And he said, slavery was not born of racism. Rather, racism was the consequence of slavery. And I include this here and I include this now because I think it's an important historical corrective. And it's important for today as well, because if racism including the racism that clearly characterized the transatlantic slave trade and the treatment of African people and the development of white supremacy and so on, if that has material causes, then it can be abolished by abolishing the material causes. Whereas if it's just an irrational prejudice that so-called white people are culturally or whatever ingrained with, then there isn't that much hope of defeating racism. So I think it is really important to kind of get that causality the right way around. So moving on, when the first slaves arrived in Virginia in 1619, the first African slaves, their conditions of life were not dissimilar to those of indentured servants, as I've said, other than in one obvious regard, that they were to serve in bondage for life rather than for a limited period, and that their children were to be born into bondage. So that, that was the major difference. And that led to a whole different range of outcomes, which I don't really have time to go into. But what was important about this sort of commonality of experience and commonality of interests between the European indentured servants and the African slaves was that it translated into solidarity between those two groups. So Theodore Allen, who I've mentioned a few times, who really is the best history of this topic, he combed the archival records, looking at everything that is left from this period that's relevant to the subject, and he found accounts of between 70 and 75 people in the sort of first 2/3 of the 17th century, collaborating across racial lines in 15 different endeavours to run away from slavery and servitude. And he found 15 instances involving 56 people of free people, so people who weren't indentured or slaves, assisting indentured servants and slaves to run away. I mean, many of them may have experienced servitude or slavery themselves. But, that's quite a striking level of solidarity that exists in the historical record. And then on the flip side, in all of that time, he found only 6 examples of sort of anti-black or anti-Negro, as the term then would have been, hostility from labouring class European Americans before 1676, which is a date I'm going to come on to. Now, of course, you have to say, what survived in the historical record, there's all these kind of problems. But, essentially, there isn't that much evidence for this widespread hostility that we often assume is there. And of those 6 cases that Allen examined, in 3 of them, there were other European American bystanders. And in 2 of those 3, the bystanders intervened and actively dissociated themselves from the chauvinism against African people. So they were, taking an anti-racist stance in most, it's a statistically insignificant number, but in the cases that we know about from the record. This solidarity between indentured European American workers, enslaved African American workers, and free workers of both African and European origins culminated in the 1676 Bacon's Rebellion. This is on the slide. It's a picture commemorating Bacon's Rebellion. The guy in the hat is Bacon, Richard Bacon. Was it? I think it was Richard, who led this uprising. Now, I'm not going to go into the details about the uprising because it isn't really that important for our purposes. But the important point is that although it began as a dispute within the ruling elite, which this guy Bacon was part of, it transformed in its later stages into a popular revolt by enslaved Africans and European Americans against the colony elite and against its monopoly on trading furs with the Native Americans. That's not really the important point. The important point is a multiracial uprising of workers burnt down most of Jamestown, the colony, because they were fighting back against their conditions of life and demanding basically, well, they're basically fighting back against the capitalist ruling elite and trying to transform society in all of their interests. So that, you know, that was a very, very important event, and that historians of this period of US history discuss a lot. But the only thing I'm going to talk about it really is to ask, what lesson then did the planters, the capitalists, learn from this? Because they were very scared by this. Remember I said that there was a tiny group of them at the top and this mass of people living in pretty dire conditions at the bottom, and they had nobody in the middle to help kind of, you know, mediate between them. They learned from this that they would have to find a way to create some kind of stability. And in order to do that, they thought that the best way of doing it would be to create a division between the African American and the European American workers in order to exercise control over both of them. That was the idea. That's what they were trying to achieve. And there was some sort of historical, I guess it wasn't really historical, some other examples that they could look to for keys about, you know, for clues about how to do this. And they looked to the English Caribbean colonies to see how had this been done, you know, where there was more stability in a lot of ways in places like Barbados at that period. So the Caribbean was an interesting phenomenon because the necessary social stability that the ruling planters wanted in order for plantation production to continue and for them to keep getting rich, they created that by deliberately fostering a coloured, as the Caribbeans would then have said, middle class. And this was comprised of two different groups. So firstly, what were called the free blacks, who were ex-slaves who had either been freed by their masters or bought their freedom. And secondly, what were then called mulattoes, which today we would say mixed heritage people, I suppose, who, you know, were more often than not in this early period the result of, well, I'm not going to mince words, the result of rape by European slave owners against African women, enslaved women. But, you know, often or occasionally the father would actually recognise the child, and they would gain access to the to the family. Essentially, this coloured, as people said at the time, you know, if you notice, I use the language from the time in order to make it kind of historically accurate. Just to be clear, obviously we shouldn't. Coloured is not a term that we use now, but this so-called coloured middle class occupied a kind of middle class position. They were the artisan producers who owned their own tools. They were clerks for the administration, things like that. And so in the Caribbean context, for a number of reasons, there was a possibility of social mobility for black and mixed race people, which was very, very different to what ended up happening in mainland North America. And so, you know, the extent of this is quite surprising, actually. I was really shocked when I read this a few years ago. There's a historian called G.J., I think you say Heuman, H-E-U-M-A-N, and he discovered that of the 310,000 slaves that there were in Jamaica on the eve of emancipation, 70,000 of those, so about, what is that, just under a quarter, were owned by black or mixed race owners. Which is quite a really surprising statistic, but you know, that shows that you could become wealthy and part of the kind of you know, rich elite if you were black or mixed race in the Caribbean, whereas you couldn't in mainland North America, and I'll come on to why. So that outcome in the Caribbean wasn't preordained. There had been an earlier attempt to create a kind of privileged middle class layer, not out of mixed race people and black people, but out of European settlers who would be who you could then kind of have as this middle class group, and they would be granted voting rights, the right to bear arms, the right to hold office, and so on. And this reached a kind of quite extreme example, where in Barbados there was something called the military tenant for a while, and he was given land at no cost. He didn't have to buy it; he was just given it by the authorities. And in return, and he had all of these privileges. He could vote in the elections for the assembly, and he could bear arms and all of that. But his only obligation was to serve in the militia. And the main purpose of the militia was to keep the slaves in line. So that was quite an extreme example of this creation of a kind of privileged white group in the Caribbean. But in the end, in the Caribbean colonies, where possibilities for a small landholding were quite limited, where Europeans tended to migrate once they'd finished their indentures, and a number of other factors, led to, instead of creating a kind of white supremacist structure per se, kind of relying on allowing a level of social mobility to black people and mixed race people as a way to maintain grip on the society and keep the plantation economy ticking over. But that is where, so the reason that Theodore Allen argues that happened in the Caribbean was because essentially there were too few poor Europeans to create an adequate middle class. They were a tiny, tiny fraction of the population. And so they did not have the numbers that they could exercise the kind of influence that was needed. And that is where the mainland colonies, so at this time Virginia and then later Maryland and elsewhere, were different. The historian Wesley Craven, who's a historian of that period, he estimates that during the 17th century, 75% or more of Virginia's settlers were servants, these indentured servants, and the vast majority of those were under indenture. As I said, these indentured servants led a miserable existence, and Virginia society offered no prospects of social mobility. So therefore, social control for the ruling class wouldn't rest on creating kind of a middle class, but instead it would rest on this downtrodden European majority being reconciled to their oppression and exploitation, but not alleviated from it. So they would continue to exist in the same kind of miserable conditions, but the ruling class would find a way to make them put up with it. And thus, in the words of Edmund Morgan, the historian who I've already quoted, by a series of acts, the assembly, which is the local government basically, deliberately did what it could to foster the contempt of whites for blacks and Indians. And here is a list of some of the things that they did. This is not a complete list. This is, some of the quite egregious and quite obvious things. So between 1667 and 1723, laws were passed by the Virginia Assembly. And again, I'm using the language from the time, which meant that free Negroes, as they were then called, even if baptized Christian, could not own slaves or indentured servants. Free Negroes couldn't vote. They couldn't hold any office of public trust. They could not be a witness in a court case against a European. So not only they couldn't be party to a court case, their testimony in court was not allowed. This one I think is quite striking, 30 lashes at the whipping post, so they'd be tied to a post and whipped, would be given if any Negro, this is the quote, if any Negro or other slave shall presume to lift up his hand in opposition against any Christian. Now, if you translate that, what that means is that any European can do to any African whatever they want, and the African person has no right to defend themselves. And if they defend themselves, they'll be tied to a post and whipped 30 times. Then free Negroes were excluded from the militia, and again, no right to defend themselves. They were forbidden from possessing any gunpowder, shot, or any club, or any other weapon whatsoever, offensive or defensive. And lastly, miscegenation, which is a fancy word meaning relationships between black and white people, marriage or not, were banned. So these were the steps that were taken. Very conscious, deliberate laws and measures were passed to create this division. And what is really important to note is that along with this came quite active propaganda. That is sort of, the 17th century equivalent of the Daily Mail headlines attacking, migrants for all our problems. The two most important pieces of legislation, which a lot of these, measures are involved in, which are the 1705 Act Concerning Servants and Slaves and the 1723 Act Directing the Trial of Slaves, they included provisions that basically said church wardens, so clergymen, and parish clerks, so the people that did the administration for the government, had to read these laws to the congregations twice a year, and that sheriffs had to do the same at the courthouse every June or July. They used to poster these, these laws around on the doorways of official buildings and churches to really hammer the point home, to say to the Europeans, you can go and do whatever you want to an African person and they can't fight back, and all of this stuff. And so this created what W.E.B. Du Bois, who's a famous black Marxist kind of sociologist, I guess, and political organizer, called a psychological wage. So his argument is that the white skin privilege, as he called it, interestingly, he's the one who coined that term about 100 years ago, white privilege, which is now used in quite a different sense today. The white skin privilege, he argued, made the European worker, no matter how poor and how degraded, proud of his so-called race because he was above the African American. And this, Du Bois called this a psychological wage. That was in place of actually a real wage, because it was the poor white people that this was aimed at. And so this, these privileges extended to English people, Scottish people, Irish people, as well as the increasing numbers of Germans, Dutch, Swedes, and others who came to North America, slightly later than the English and the Irish and the Scottish did. And thus, for the next few centuries, the poorest white workers would enthusiastically take part, not all of them, but many of them, enthusiastically take part in the militias rounding up runaway slaves. They would enthusiastically take part in the public lynchings and other forms of racist violence. And they would also reconcile themselves to their own oppression and exploitation. And this was the point of doing this. This was why the ruling class opted for this strategy. If we go back, and, look at this. This is 1774. So a year before the American Revolution, you have what are actually, skilled workers being traded around. This is an advert saying, I have just imported these skilled people, and some of them not so skilled, but, I've just imported these workers. Come and buy their contracts off me and have indentured servants. And so, this kind of situation still existed for so-called white workers for a long time. And, the whole purpose of this, this situation, this strategy, was to reconcile people to their own oppression and exploitation. And the kind of evidence for this is, if you look at the history of North America, those areas where white consciousness, racial consciousness, white pride or whatever people call it, was the strongest, was also where the white people, the white workers, were the poorest. And this is not because poverty breeds ignorance or something like that. It's because the consciousness, their association, their belief that they were better than the African Americans because they were white, and that they had more in common with the white ruling class than they did with the African American workers, meant that they never fought for their own interests. They never fought back and organized with their brothers and sisters who happened to be black. And so the areas that were the most, these white supremacist ideas were the most strong, were also the areas where the white workers were the poorest and had the worst conditions of life. And this is where all this kind of hillbilly redneck stuff comes from. the sort of white racists in the US are sort of the caricature or whatever is that they're very poor. Well, that's, this is the history to all that. And so I think that this last point is beautifully summed up by Noel Ignatieff, who was a kind of Marxist revolutionary writer from the States. I'll just make this final point, do some bullet points, and then I'm done. He said, "White supremacy is the real secret of the rule of the bourgeoisie and the hidden cause behind the failure of the labour movement in this country, i.e. the US. White skin privileges serve only the bourgeoisie, and precisely for that reason, they will not let us escape them, but instead pursue us with them through every hour of our life, no matter where we go. But they are poison bait. To suggest that the acceptance of white skin privilege is in the interests of white workers is equivalent to suggesting that swallowing the worm with the hook is in the interests of the fish. To argue that repudiating these privileges is a sacrifice is to argue that the fish is making a sacrifice when it leaps from the water, flips its tail, shakes its head furiously in every direction, and throws the barbed offering." And I think that sums things up quite well. So I will just do my 3 sort of takeaway bullet points. So the first important thing is that the white race and white supremacy have a historical origin. That is really important to understand, because if they have a historical origin, then they can have a historical ending. Secondly, the white skin privilege, this privileged position occupied by European workers, where they would get to vote, they would get to bear arms and so on, was deliberately and consciously invented by the ruling class in order that they could keep exploiting workers of all ethnicities. And thirdly, the white skin privilege and white supremacy is only in the interests, in the end, of the ruling class because of the role it plays in dividing black and white workers against each other. It is not in the interests of the so-called white working class because it reconciles, white working class people to a brutally oppressive and exploitative system. And this last point is really important because what it means is that there is a real basis for winning white workers to an anti-racist position. People aren't being asked to sacrifice anything. They're being asked to act in their real interests. And I think that's a very important place to end. So that's it.
So there is no objective basis for race. Its meaning has changed constantly throughout history as different historical processes played out and in different historical different historical actors fought over its meaning. It has manifested differently at different times, predicated to the extent of British personal contact with other peoples, importantly, the degree of informality or formality of the empire and the strength or weakness of the national economy. So James already explained the development of the white race in North America. Britain has a different history. As the historian C. Bolt has pointed out, the word race was first used in English literature as denoting a class of people, even a family. In 18th century usage, it was possible to speak of a race of animals or birds. By the 19th century, however, its imprecision was leading to confusion. In 1863, James Hunt, president of the London Anthropological Society, observed that hardly two persons use such an important word as race in the same sense. Historian and socialist Laura Tobili has explained why it is important that we don't assume that notions of race were the same in Britain and the US. She criticizes the retching of a reified construct of whiteness from the historical context of antebellum United States for use to explain racial relationships and practices with quite different historical contexts. She explains that she has never encountered in a historical source of 19th or early 20th century Britain a historical actor using the term whiteness to describe his identity. In Britain during the Victorian era, instead, one frequently would find references to the English race. This, for example, is a term used in the immensely popular Oceania or England and Her Colonies by J.A. Ford in 1890, even when writing about the Dominions, Canada, New Zealand, and South Africa, context where the British settlers increasingly were coming to describe themselves as white, just like the United States. In Britain, the word race was largely synonymous with the word nation until the 1930s. Britain developed its own deeply racist ideas based not on whiteness, but on other considerations. Take, for example, the 19th century Irishman who decides whether to go to England or to the US. If he chooses the former, he's the target of racial abuse, caricatures of Irish people as monkeys are common in papers, racism is whipped up among English workers against him, etc. But if he goes to the US, suddenly he is not racially oppressed. He is magically something called white, and he has the right to bear arms, to vote, stand for elected office, etc. Racism against the Irish in Britain was as overt as racism against African Americans in the US, with signs displayed including "No Irish need apply" and "No Irish, no blacks, no dogs." And this was well into the 20th century. And it remains a deep-rooted anti-Irish racism to this day. We can also see the more contemporary example of Polish and other Eastern European immigrants who have also been targets of racial abuse and victimized by the racist immigration system despite their status as EU citizens. In the British context, colonialism and scientific racism combined in British thought, an argument that I'm sure you hear repeated today, that Britain had culturally and technologically enriched these colonies. These debates notably still happen today, and it's notable that it permits these racist narratives to remain as part of public discourse. This narrative developed to justify Britain and British, to justify Britain's and British businesses' subjugation of these people and plundering of their countries. So, as part of this, there was this idea of this civilizing mission, which is like a large part of the narrative that somehow uplifted these colonies, and this originated in the Christian theology of the Middle Ages, when European theologists applied the metaphor of human development to misrepresent social change as a law of nature. In the 18th century, Europeans saw history as linear, inevitable, and perpetual process of social cultural evolution, and more importantly, saw this process as being led by capitalist Western Europe. From this reductionist cultural perspective of Western Europe, colonialists saw the non-European peoples of the world as backward nations, and non-Europeans as people intrinsically incapable of socio-economic progress. This was then used as moral cover for colonization. A particular example of this developed in the process of British colonization in Asia, and this was with the myth of the Marshall race. It's important to note that Britain obviously had no respect for the cultures they were invading. Their only concern was assimilating them into functional apparatus of the empire. They immediately set about oversimplifying an entire subcontinent, from ethnic groups to classes, religions to professions, and castes to clans. And they ensured to keep Indians in conflict with each other and not their true oppressors. Two wars in particular, which England struggled through with unexpected difficulty and extensive local help, had lasting effects on British perspectives of South Asians. Anglo-Nepalese War of 1814 to 1816 and the First Indian War of Independence in 1857. In their wake, Brits began to designate certain South Asian ethnic groups as martial races from which to recruit soldiers. In the eyes of the British men, people from the martial races are strong, tough, and savage, born into violent, warlike cultures, raised to prize military prowess above all other pursuits, naturally inclined to raid their neighbours or when no neighbours could be found to fight among themselves, stubborn and simple-minded despite all their martial skill, easily controlled by more graceful, cerebral people, a rare few could be whipped into shape as honourable soldiers for a good cause. So this is what the British people were making of these different groups. And it obviously reflects how the situation in the region at the time and how they were separating these groups out. So unsurprisingly, following Indian independence, the Indian government in February 1949 abolished the official application of martial race principles with regard to military recruitment. Celebrated racist Winston Churchill was reportedly concerned that the theory was being abandoned during the war and wrote to the Commander-in-Chief of India that he must rely as much as possible on the martial races. So we can see that Britain's homegrown racism is tightly interwoven with the idea of the British Empire. A YouGov poll in 2014 shows just how extensively pervasive this myth is among the British public, with 59% of those polled stating that they thought that the British Empire was something to be proud of, and 49% felt that the Empire's legacy left former colonies better off. And this is with 36% stating they didn't know one way or the other. So the formal British Empire is a thing of the past, but this pervading belief of Britain's moral authority remains an important resource for the British state, who continues its exploitation of former colonies and other countries around the world and assists with the policing of the globe as well through direct actions in the cases of Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and others, where Britain's moral duty to intervene plays a key role in their justifications to go to war, but also through its massive investment and support of the British arms trade. These myths are supported through both the education system and through the media, with the BBC continuing to churn out programming nostalgic of the empire, while it seems that any criticism of the empire must be counterposed with this veiling of Britain's past crimes. So by now, I hope I've made the case that racism in Britain fundamentally has its own character, directly rooted in the historical development of Britain as a former colonizer and contemporary imperialist power. But it is undeniable that white supremacy is a distinct trend and plays a particular and important role in Britain. One of the first large-scale exposures of the British public to the idea of racial unity in the terms of the context of whiteness was through Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. That Kipling's poem was a call for the annexation of the Philippines is a simple statement of fact. It is in America that the message is clear, whereas in Britain, it had to be explained with the additional subtitle and addressed to the United States. This is because the language that was being used in there was very specific, specifically speaking to people in the US, and wouldn't have been as clear to people in Britain. But this subtitle has been omitted from most reprints, so it's all this fact is also like being kept from us by omission. And the context for this is the different forms taken in two contexts by the relationship between race and empire. Importantly, the poem was widely distributed in newspapers at the time. And it's shown that many of the British newspapers played up the racial unity between the Anglo-Saxons implicit in Kipling's poem, emphasizing racial similarities to use American prejudices to further their own ends. The Spectator, for example, openly acknowledged the significance of the poem. And they wrote, "It is the prerogative of Mr. Rudyard Kipling to embody the ringing verse, the latent thought of the English-speaking peoples. The duty of the white man is to conquer and control, probably for a couple of centuries, all the dark peoples of the world, not for his own good, but for theirs. Nevertheless, there is our duty clear before us, and Mr. Kipling bids us perform it, though we do not reap our own rewards, the blame of those we better, the hate of those we guard." So yeah, so writer's more recent work on Kipling then confirmed observations that he, of the ideal of the great blood brotherhood continued to exist in an attenuated form in the minds of many prominent politicians and public figures in Britain and America and the English colonies of white settlements in the years up to and after the First World War. The ideological framing of the Anglo-Saxon Brotherhood is a useful tool since the disassembly of the empire and the wide-scale independence movements in other former colonies of European powers. Many of these hold important strategic positions in the global structures of imperialism. This identification of whiteness is a useful tool when these structures have needed defending. A useful example is found in Britain's support of apartheid South Africa. Now, it's important that we be clear that it was not the ideas of white supremacy that led to Britain's support of apartheid. It was the historical basis of South Africa as a British colony and the trade that continued as part of that legacy. However, in South Africa, the conditions have much more in common with the US context, the settler colony settled by Europeans and with a substantial European working class population. In these conditions, they developed a system not dissimilar from the United States. The US, South Africa, and Britain all share the British language, along with strong alliances, which meant it was very easy for ideas of the white race to circulate, even where in Britain it did not correspond to the material conditions present here. An example of the circulation is in the quarter of the century after 1890, US exported a large number of mining engineers, and with them a lot of US capital goods. Typically well trained, such engineers replaced European experts in Asia, Mexico, South America, Australia, and African mines in significant measure because they were so loudly proclaimed a knowledge gained from the intersection of race and management, i.e. the separation of the settler and the local workforce. In South Africa, half of the new gold mines had US managers in 1895. And this kind of exchange still continues today between settler colonial states and their imperialist allies. A notable and relevant example was raised recently in the Black Lives Matter movement regarding policing and military tactics being exchanged between the US and Israeli forces. So in closing, we can see that despite Britain's own individual forms of racism that have developed out of Britain's unique historical process, from the world's oldest imperial power to its current state of decay, that white supremacy and the surrounding narratives, important as they are, play an important but useful role in both reinforcing and broadening the scope of British racism and a sense of entitlement to other whites, and thus creating a sense of unity between Britain and its allies, while also undermining working class unity here in Britain by fomenting divisions on racial lines. It is crucially important for the British state to continue, for the continued survival of British capital, that its allies and their alliances retain their legitimacy as they are key to supporting Britain's assets around the globe, which stand at about 6 times that of Britain's gross domestic income. So, in short, yeah, like the situation here in Britain is very different, and we see that this system, the system here makes use of white supremacy to sort of reinforce these ideas and offer a sense of legitimacy to a lot of its imperialist alliances and subjugation around the world. And it's absolutely necessary for Britain in its current form to keep on doing so. So yeah, that's the end of my introduction.